Welcome, dear viewers, to this extraordinary journey into the heart of history. A journey that begins, long before the clash of armies and the clash of empires. Today, we set out to uncover the little-known story of a boy who would one day rise to become one of the greatest figures in world history. Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyūb, known in the West as Saladin. Before the crowns, before the conquests, before the legacy of honor and chivalry that has echoed through centuries, there was a child who walked the dusty streets of Tikrit, who listened to stories of faith and courage, who learned the weight of leadership long before he wore the mantle of power. This video is not merely about battles and victories. It is about roots, struggles, dreams, and the shaping of a soul, destined to change the course of nations. So, sit back, open your hearts, and allow yourselves to step into the world of Saladin's early years. For in these first chapters of his life, we find not only the making of a leader, but timeless lessons for us all. A cold night in Tikrit. A newborn's first cries echo through the stone walls of a modest home. Outside, his father faces exile, stripped of power and protection. At that very moment, when all seems lost, a fragile child is born. No one knew that this boy, born into uncertainty and displacement, would grow into the man who would stand before kings and crusaders, not as a conqueror alone, but as a symbol of justice, mercy, and unshakable faith. This is not the story of a legend told from the heights of glory. This is the story of a child, fragile yet unbreakable, whose earliest struggles lit the fire that would one day burn across the stage of history. The year is ʿImād. The night is heavy with silence in the small city of Tikrit, nestled along the Tigris River. Inside a modest stone house, a child's first cry pierces the darkness. That child is Nur al Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, later known as Saladin. His birth, however, is not celebrated with triumph, but overshadowed by despair. Saladin's father, Najm al Dīn Ayyūb, once the governor of Tikrit, is a man marked by fate. Just hours before his son's birth, he was stripped of his office and forced into exile by the ruling powers. His brother, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, a fierce and ambitious warrior, stands by his side. Both men know their family's future is uncertain. As the baby's cries echo, Najm ad-Din gazes upon his son. His heart is torn. How can he rejoice when his family must abandon their home before dawn? Yet, he whispers a prayer, calling upon Allah to grant the boy strength greater than his father's own. In that fragile moment, the destiny of a leader begins. The family leaves Tikrit under the cover of darkness. Najm ad-Din rides with quiet dignity, holding the weight of disgrace on his shoulders. Behind him, Shirkuh's eyes burn with fury and defiance. He vows that exile will not be their end. The caravan moves slowly along the river road. The stars above glitter like distant witnesses to history. Saladin, still an infant, rests in his mother's arms, though he cannot yet speak or walk. His very presence is a symbol of resilience. Born on the night of loss, he is destined to turn exile into triumph. This chapter is not of victories or battles, but of beginnings written in hardship. Saladin's earliest breath comes not in a palace of power, but in the shadows of displacement. Yet within this hardship lies the seed of greatness. The boy who enters the world as a child of exile will grow into the man who embodies hope for millions. The boy who would be known as Saladin was born into hardship, but his family's past was rich with honor. His lineage was Kurdish, from a proud clan known for loyalty, resilience, and service to rulers across the Muslim world. Though exiled from Tikrit, Najm ad-Din Ayyub carried with him more than disgrace. He carried a legacy. Around campfires, young Saladin would one day hear stories of his ancestors. Warriors who roamed the rugged Kurdish mountains, men who valued loyalty above wealth, and women who bore hardship with unwavering strength. From the beginning, his family instilled in him the idea that true greatness is measured not by fortune, but by character. Najm al Dīn himself embodied this lesson. Though he had fallen from power, he refused to bow to despair. He told his brother Shirkuh, "A man's honor is not in his throne, but in his deeds." These words would echo in Saladin's memory as he grew. As the family traveled toward Mosul, they carried little, some clothes, a few books, and their faith, but they carried much in spirit. Najm al Dīn reminded his children that they belonged to a people who endured hardship with dignity. That honor, he said, was their inheritance. For young Saladin, this invisible treasure became a foundation. Though too young to understand fully, he absorbed the values that flowed through his household: faith, loyalty, justice, and honor. They would become the pillars of his future leadership. While other men of power sought to rebuild their lives through greed or ambition, Najm al Dīn sought to rebuild his family's life through trust in God and steadfast integrity. This quiet dignity became a torch passed to his son. Thus, the story of Saladin's early years is not just about exile and loss. It is about the forging of a spirit rooted in the honor of his family, the courage of his uncle Shirkuh, and the unwavering faith of his father. These would guide Saladin through every trial ahead. Tikrit, once a stronghold of stability for the Ayyubid family, had become a place of sorrow. The walls that had sheltered Saladin's first breaths now closed against his family. Political tides had shifted, and Najm al Dīn Ayyūb was forced to surrender his position. The reason was not incompetence, but circumstance. The politics of the region were ruthless. Alliances broke as quickly as they were formed, and rivals took advantage of the smallest pretext. Najm al Dīn, despite his fairness, was accused of siding wrongly in a dispute that offended the ruling powers. The verdict was swift: banishment. The night of exile came heavy. Soldiers loyal to the governor's new ally arrived at Ayyub's residence. They offered no kindness, only orders. Najm al Dīn, maintaining dignity, gathered his family. His wife wrapped infant, Saladin, in a blanket, shielding him from the cold air and the harshness of the soldiers' stares. Shirkuh, ever defiant, placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. His warrior's pride urged him to resist, but Ayyub's calm voice restrained him. A man may lose his post, but he must not lose his honor. Reluctantly, Shirkuh lowered his hand, swallowing the fire in his chest. As the family prepared to leave, the city of Tikrit lay silent under the stars. Neighbors whispered from their doors, some sorrowful, others relieved. Exile was harsh, but worse still was disgrace. Yet Najm al Dīn carried himself as though this was not the end, but a turning. They departed at dawn. Horses carried their meager belonging. The streets that once echoed with respect now resounded only with the clatter of hooves fading into distance. For Saladin, swaddled in his mother's arms, this was the first journey of his life. A journey begun not with triumph, but with loss. But in loss lies shaping. The boy's earliest memory, etched not in words but in the spirit of his family, was of courage in the face of humiliation. This silent lesson would forge the resilience of the leader he would become. The fall of Tikrit was not just the exile of a family. It was the beginning of a destiny. The road to Mosul was long, harsh, and uncertain. For Najm al Dīn Ayyūb and his family, exile from Tikrit had stripped them of their status, but not of their will to endure. Their destination was Mosul, a city ruled by ʿImād ad-Dīn Zangī, a powerful Atabeg, whose court was both feared and respected across the Muslim world. The journey itself was perilous. The caravan moved slowly along the banks of the Tigris River. Harsh winds swept across the plains, and the cold nights bit deep. For Saladin, still a newborn, every mile was a test of survival. His mother cradled him tightly against her chest, shielding him from the biting air. At times, Shirkuh would ride ahead, scanning the horizon for raiders. His eyes were sharp, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword. Fierce though he was, he carried a silent tenderness toward his nephew. Often, when the caravan stopped to rest, he would lean close to peer at the sleeping child, muttering, "The boy will not grow weak. He will rise from this." Najm al Dīn rode with a calm dignity, though in his heart he bore a storm. He had failed in Tikrit, but he would not fail his family. His hopes rested on Mosul, where Zengid was known to reward loyalty and skill. If fortune favored them, exile could turn into opportunity. The road was not without danger. Once, a band of desperate thieves approached the caravan under cover of night, but Shirkuh's vigilance and the small band of loyal men, darted still with them, were enough to drive the attackers away. The clash of steel under the moonlight reminded all that the road to Mosul was as unforgiving as the politics of the region. At last, the walls of Mosul came into sight. Rising strong and proud above the Tigris, the city glimmered with the promise of new beginnings. Najm ad-Din's heart steadied. Here, perhaps, his family could find refuge. Here, perhaps, his son could grow not as a child of exile, but as one destined for greatness. For Saladin, this journey would remain a shadowed memory, unseen but felt, shaping the resilience and endurance that would later define his character. His life, barely begun, was already a journey from hardship toward destiny. The flight to Mosul was not an end. It was the first step on a path that would lead to empires, battles, and legacies that echoed across centuries. Mosul rose before them like a promise chiseled in stone. High walls, copper domes, market cries flowing like a river through its gates. But promises have weight, and exile heavier still. Najm al Dīn Ayyūb kept his back straight as the caravan entered the city. He rented a simple, sun-baked room near the gate. One window, a reed mat, a clay lamp, and the soft rasp of the Tigris wind. His wife laid the swaddled infant on folded cloth, humming a verse that steadied the room. Across the alley, a water seller called the price of a jug. Every coin felt like a decision. Shirkuh refused to let the quiet swallow them. He drilled the few loyal men who had followed from Tikrit. Stance, shield, breath. Steel rang against steel in the dusty lot behind the house. Children gathered to watch. Some whispered, "Exiles," as if the word were an illness. Shirkuh met their stares and smiled like a challenge. At dawn, Najm ad-Din went to the congregational mosque. He washed with cool water, then knelt on woven palm, bowing until his brow touched the mat. When he rose, he asked the imam for guidance and work. Nothing grand, only a post worthy of honest hands. "Zengid values loyalty," the imam said. "Patience is a road as real as the one you traveled." Days gathered into a rhythm, supplications at sunrise, inquiries at court, the brassy hymn of the market, drill in the yard, study by lamplight. Najm ad-Din copied letters in a careful hand, preparing a petition for audience. He refused to let humiliation write his future. He would write it himself, stroke by measured stroke. "A man carries two burdens," he told his brother, "his reputation and his family. If one must bend, let it be the first." Shirkuh laughed, low and fond. "Then I will carry the reputation, until you need it again. ʿImād. The child slept through most of this life of counting coins and counting breaths. Yet something seeped into him. The sound of steel ringing true, the hush of prayer, the kindness of strangers, the dignity of a man who would not bow to despair. Exile pressed upon the Ayyubids, but pressure can carve stone into form. When Zengid's steward finally sent word, "Present yourselves," Najm al Din folded the letter with steady fingers. The weight had not vanished. It had simply taught them how to stand beneath it. In the modest courtyards of Mosul, a figure loomed larger than life. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, brother of Najm al Dīn Ayyūb, and uncle to the infant Saladin. Where Ayyub carried dignity in restraint, Shirkuh bore fire in his veins. He was a man carved by the sword, broad-shouldered, with eyes that burned like embers beneath a battle-worn brow. Every morning, before the city stirred, he gathered the small retinue that had followed him from Tikrit. Shields clashed, swords rang, and the sound of his barked commands echoed between the walls. Children of Mosul peeked through wooden doors to watch the exiled warrior train, as though he commanded an army. For Saladin, though too young to wield a blade, the rhythms of his uncle's drills became part of his earliest world. He would sit in his mother's lap, eyes wide, as Shirkuh moved like a storm across the yard. With every strike, every parry, the boy absorbed not just the art of war, but the presence of strength. Yet Shirkuh was not a man of simple violence. Second twins, in quiet hours, he took the child into his arms, lifting him high into the air. One day, Yusuf, he would whisper, calling Saladin by his given name, "You will not only watch the clash of steel, you will lead it. You will not fear the battlefield, for the battlefield will fear you." The men who trained under him admired his ferocity, but also his loyalty. Despite exile, despite disgrace, Shirkuh never abandoned his brother. "Ayyub has honor," he declared often, "and honor is a fortress stronger than stone." These words, repeated in the boy's hearing, became part of the atmosphere he breathed. But Shirkuh's life was not without flaws. Quick to anger, quicker still to raise his hand, he sometimes quarreled even with Ayyub. Their differences, one hot as fire, the other calm as water, shaped the balance of the household. In these arguments, Saladin would one day learn a valuable truth. Leadership required not only strength, but control of strength. One evening, under the torchlight of the courtyard, Shirkuh recited tales of the great warriors of Islam, Khalid ibn al-Walid, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and others who fought with both sword and faith. His voice thundered as he spoke of courage and sacrifice. The men sat spellbound. The boy gazed in silence, and Ayyub watched, half smiling, for he knew his son's imagination was being etched with the legends of valor. Thus, the figure of Shirkuh became both shield and fire in Saladin's earliest years. He embodied the warrior spirit, fierce, loyal, unyielding. And though the child could not yet understand, a seed had been planted. The idea that power must be harnessed by honor, and that the strength of a man lies not just in the sword he wields, but in the cause for which he lifts it. If Shirkuh was the fire of Saladin's early world, then Najm al Dīn Ayyūb, his father, was the steady water that gave life and calm. Where the uncle's lessons roared like thunder, the father's teaching flowed quietly, weaving strength with wisdom. In the humble home at Mosul, Najm al Din often gathered his children and a few of his retainers in the cool shade of the courtyard. Instead of swords and drills, his instruments were words, parables, and verses from the Quran. Saladin, though still very young, sat close to his father's knee, wide-eyed and attentive. Honor, Ayyub would say, is not carried on a blade, but in the heart of a man. A sword can defend it, But only character can create it. He told stories of prophets and just rulers, men who governed not through fear, but through fairness and humility. His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that carved lessons deep into memory. At the mosque, he would take Saladin by the hand and guide him through the rituals of prayer. Though the boy could not yet recite fully, Ayyub insisted he mimic the motions, bowing, prostrating, whispering supplications. Even a child, he told Shirkuh once, must learn that strength without God is an empty shell. Khor, the neighbors in Mosul, began to notice the contrast between the two brothers, where Shirkuh's courtyard thundered with battle drills. Ayyub's house glowed with the serenity of study and reflection. Both were necessary. Yet it was in Ayyub's patient teaching that Saladin's moral compass was quietly set. Even in matters of hardship, Ayyub taught lessons. When food ran short, he showed his family how to share with neighbors who were poorer. Still, when disputes rose in the alleyway, he stepped in, not with threats, but with calm words that cooled tempers. Justice, he said, is the first sword a leader must wield. One night, as Saladin lay beside him, restless with the noise of soldiers outside, Ayyub whispered to him a phrase that would stay for a lifetime. "My son, remember this. The world honors the man who honors others. Do not seek glory for yourself. Seek it for the justice you bring." The lessons were subtle, almost invisible at times, but they sank deep. Between his uncle's thunder and his father's calm, the boy learned that leadership was not merely force. It was a balance of courage, honor, and mercy. Years later, when men would call him both warrior and sultan, Saladin would recall not only Shirkuh's drills but also Najm al Din's quiet voice. Justice is the first sword. Zubaydah in Mosul, where minarets pierced the sky and the markets hummed with traders from distant lands. Young Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the boy who would be Saladin, began his first steps into scholarship. His father, Najm al Din, had already sown the seeds of honor and faith. But now came the tending of the mind. Najm al Din arranged for tutors from the mosque, men respected for their knowledge of Quran, Hadith, and Arabic literature. Each morning, Saladin rose before the sun, washed in cool water, and sat cross-legged on woven mats with a reed pen in hand. His small fingers clumsily traced letters on parchment, ink blotting where his eagerness outran his precision. The Imam, a patient scholar with a voice like flowing water, guided the boy through recitation. Saladin's young voice faltered at first, but his determination was clear. He listened, repeated, corrected, and repeated again until the words of the Quran flowed from his lips with clarity. His eyes glowed with pride. Each time his father nodded approval. Beyond recitation, he was taught the basics of law and history. Stories of the great caliphs and just rulers stirred his imagination. He marveled at tales of Caliph Umar's simplicity, of Ali's wisdom, of Khalid ibn al-Walid's brilliance in battle. Though still a child, he began to dream, not of wealth, but of a life lived in service to something greater than himself. At home, he carried his lessons further. He would sit with his mother and recite verses aloud, his clear child's voice filling the room. She listened with soft eyes, correcting his mistakes gently. Shirkuh, overhearing sometimes, would grin and say, "Good. A man must know his faith before he can wield his sword." The city itself became a classroom. In the bustling markets, Saladin listened to merchants argue over weights and measures. From them, he learned the importance of honesty in trade. At the mosque, he observed judges settling disputes with fairness. From them, he absorbed the power of justice. In the evening, he sat by the lamps with his father, copying Arabic proverbs, learning that wisdom was often hidden in the simplest words. It was here that the boy earned his first name of respect among neighbors. A merchant once said, after hearing the boy's clear recitation, "This Yusuf has the tongue of a scholar." The remark pleased Najm al Dīn. But more importantly, it left an imprint on Saladin's heart. Though still far from the battlefield, Saladin was beginning to understand that a leader's strength must rest not only in the sword, but in the mind and the spirit. And so, under the arches of Mosul's mosques and in the humble corners of his family's home, the child of exile became the child of learning. By the time Saladin reached boyhood, the lessons of reading and recitation had already taken root. But knowledge of words was not enough. His father believed that true strength came when faith became the compass of the soul. Thus, young Yusuf was placed under the care of spiritual mentors within Mosul's mosques, where devotion was shaped not by sword or ink alone, but by heart and humility. The great mosque of Mosul became a second home for him. Its courtyard, filled with the murmurs of prayer, rang with the voices of scholars who taught the sciences of faith. One elderly imam, Sheikh Abdullah, took special interest in the boy. His beard was white, his eyes deep with patience, and his tones steady as the flowing Tigris. "Knowledge without faith," he told Yusuf, "is like a tree without roots. Strong winds will tear it down, but a tree rooted in belief will stand for centuries." Saladin listens with the awe of a child and the hunger of a student. He was taught not only the rituals of prayer, but their meaning, bowing as a sign of humility, prostration as a surrender of ego, supplication as a rope that tied man to his creator. He learned the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, stories of compassion, justice, and mercy. Each night, he repeated them aloud until they sank into his memory, like verses etched in stone. Najm al Dīn often accompanied his son, guiding him through the mosque's colonnades. When the boy faltered in recitation, Ayyub placed a steady hand on his shoulder and said, "Do not only memorize, my son, understand. These words must live in your actions, not just your tongue." In the quiet hours before dawn, Saladin sometimes joined his father in prayer. The lamps glowed faintly, the air crisp, and together they knelt in silence broken only by whispered Quranic verses. For the child, these moments became sacred, his first taste of spiritual discipline. But the shaping of faith was not confined to mosques. In the alleys of Mosul, Yusuf saw beggars asking for bread. One winter day, when the family had little to share, his father still ordered food to be given. "Charity," he said, "is not about abundance. It is about the heart." Yusuf never forgot the warmth in the beggar's eyes that day. Even Shirkuh, though rough in his soldierly ways, reinforced the message in his own fashion. "A warrior who fears nothing but God," he declared, "cannot be defeated." His words, though blunt, impressed the young boy who was learning that strength and faith were inseparable. By the time the boy was 10, faith had become more than duty. It was the wellspring of his character. His prayer mat was no longer a place of imitation, but of conviction. In the stillness of those early years, the roots of Saladin's spiritual devotion sank deep into the soil of his soul, roots that would anchor him through the storms of power, politics, and war that awaited him as Saladin approached the threshold of youth. The hardships of exile, the lessons of his father, the fire of his uncle, and the guidance of his teachers had already begun to weave into something greater. He was no longer just the child of Tikrit's fall. He was a boy standing at the edge of destiny, his eyes already searching beyond the walls of Mosul. By day, he still studied with his tutors, scripture, history, and the principles of justice. So, by evening, He would slip away to the city's gates and watch the caravans entering from distant lands. Merchants from Aleppo, pilgrims from Baghdad, soldiers from Damascus, all passed before him. Each face carried stories of places beyond his reach. The boy listened eagerly, asking questions about lands he had never seen, the deserts of Arabia, the fortresses of the Crusaders, the great libraries of Cairo. "Why must our lives be bound by exile?" he once asked his father, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Najm al Din smiled gently. "Exile is only the beginning of the road. Yusuf, the world is wide, and a man of honor will one day walk its breadth. Be patient, and your path will come." At night, dreams began to fill him. He dreamed of armies clashing under banners of different colors, of cities rising from the dust, of standing before multitudes not as a child of exile, but as a leader of men. In these visions, he did not crave wealth or palaces. What stirred him was the idea of unity, of lifting people beyond his. Shirkuh, noticing the boy's distant eyes, teased him. "What do you see, nephew?" "Castles in the sky?" Saladin, shy but firm, replied, "I see a land where Muslims are not divided, where justice is stronger than greed." For a moment, even the fiery Shirkuh fell silent, as if the boy's words struck deeper than jest. The people of Mosul, too, began to notice. The child once whispered about as an exile now stood taller, more thoughtful. His recitations in the mosque carried confidence. His questions to scholars showed unusual depth. Some began to murmur, "This boy is not ordinary. There is purpose in his eyes." Najm al Din nurtured this quietly. "Do not be satisfied with what you see here," he told his son. "The world is larger than Mosul, larger even than Damascus or Baghdad. You must prepare not only for the life before you, but for the life destiny will place in your hands." Thus, the first phase of Saladin's life, the years of exile, hardship, and learning, closed not in despair but in vision. His dreams stretched beyond borders. Though still a boy, he carried within him the stirrings of the man who would one day rise to unite lands, face empires, and the child of exile was becoming the child of destiny. By his early teens, Yusuf ibn Ayyub's days were no longer filled only with childish wonder. The boy's routine became rigorous. Mornings at the mosque school, afternoons in study halls, evenings in prayer and discussion with his father. Knowledge was becoming his true battlefield. His tutors taught him Quran with precision, demanding perfect recitation. Saladin's young voice grew steady, clear, and melodious. He delved into hadith, memorizing sayings of the prophets of Plavolisazan. His curiosity extended to law and governance, why certain judgments were made, why rulers succeeded or failed. His teachers noted that unlike other boys, Saladin never asked simply what to think, but why. In addition to religious studies, he was introduced to Arabic poetry and literature. He admired the works of al-Mutanabbi, whose verses stirred pride and longing for greatness. He scribbled lines of verse himself, crude yet passionate, filling scraps of parchment. Najm al Din encouraged this, reminding his son that a leader must understand both the sword and the pen. A ruler ignorant of knowledge is like a blind man leading others into darkness, he told him. Saladin listened, storing away every phrase. Though Shirkuh urged him toward military training, Saladin knew that his path began here, in the pursuit of wisdom. He was shaping his mind to match the vision that had already begun to stir within him. Though scholarship formed his mind, Shirkuh would not let his nephew neglect the art of war. At dawn, while most boys still slept, Saladin joined his uncle in the training yard. Wooden swords clashed, shields thudded, sweat poured, His arms ached, his body protested, but Shirkuh barked, "A leader must endure more than any soldier. He commands." The boy learned to ride horses with steady hands, to notch arrows with precision, to march in step with soldiers. At first clumsy, he soon found rhythm. His father watched with quiet approval. Though gentler than Shirkuh, Ayyub knew these lessons were necessary. Saladin learned battlefield formations by drawing lines in the dirt. Shirkuh demonstrated ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and the importance of discipline. "Courage without order is chaos," he roared, drilling the lesson into the boy. Though still young, Saladin showed promise. He did not fight for glory, but to master himself. Every bruise was a lesson, every mistake a chance to grow. In war, he was learning strength and patience must march side by side. War was not only in weapons, it was in the mind. In evenings, Saladin sat with older men around low wooden tables, where the game of chess was played. Carved pieces clacked on the board, battles fought with thought instead of steel. He quickly became fascinated. Every move revealed patience, foresight, and the weight of decisions. He lost often at first, but each loss sharpened him. He began to see the game as a reflection of life itself. One must protect the weak, sacrifice when necessary, and never underestimate the opponent. Najm al Dīn encouraged this pastime, saying, "Chess is the battlefield of the mind. It will teach you to govern men before you command them." Even Shirkuh, though skeptical, admitted grudgingly, "Better he lose here than on the real field." In time, Saladin began to surprise his elders. He anticipated traps, turned defeats into victories, and earned respect as a cunning strategist. For a boy in exile, chess became more than play. It was preparation for the weight of decisions he would one day carry as his family's, standing slowly recovered under Zengid's protection. Saladin was occasionally allowed into the halls of Mosul's court. Here, the boy witnessed the machinery of power firsthand. He watched as governors presented petitions, as judges debated laws, as soldiers pledged loyalty. He observed not only words, but gestures, how men bowed, how silence could be as commanding as speech. Najm al Din used these moments as lessons. "See, Yusuf," he whispered, "power is not only in the voice, it is in restraint. Watch how a ruler listens more than he speaks." Saladin learned court etiquette, how to stand, when to bow, when to speak. Though shy at first, his keen eyes missed little. He saw greed disguised as loyalty, ambition cloaked in courtesy. These observations would later guide him in the treacherous waters of politics. Though merely a youth, the boy left each visit with new understanding. Courts were as much battlefields as any yard of swords, and here, victory belonged to patience and wisdom. It was a small task, but for Saladin it felt monumental. When he was about 15, his father entrusted him with overseeing the collection of provisions for their household and retainers. It meant negotiating with merchants, settling disputes fairly, and keeping records. Though nervous, Saladin approached the task seriously. At the market, a dispute broke out between two traders. One accused the other of short weights. The young boy listened carefully, inspected the scales, and declared judgment. The dishonest seller must repay what was owed. To everyone's surprise, his decision was accepted without challenge. Word spread quickly. The son of Ayyub judged with fairness, though still a boy. Neighbors began to bring small matters to him, testing his sense of justice. Each time, Saladin responded with calm reasoning. Najm al Din watched proudly. "Authority begins in small things," he told him. "If you are just in the market, you will be just on the throne. If you fail here, you will fail everywhere." For Saladin, this was the first taste of responsibility, the beginning of a journey not only as a scholar or soldier, but as a leader. By his mid-teens, Saladin's life was balanced between study and training. Yet one figure loomed over him more than any teacher or tutor: his uncle, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. Shirkuh's reputation in Mosul was growing. He led expeditions for Zengid, commanding men with ferocity and tactical brilliance. Whenever he returned from campaign, his armor dented and his beard dark with dust, the household buzzed with awe. Saladin watched him like a shadow, following his movements, absorbing his fiery energy. At night, Shirkuh recounted battles, ambushes in the desert, charges against fortified walls, and daring escapes. His booming voice painted pictures of valor and danger. Saladin, enthralled, began to imagine himself in such campaigns. But what struck him most was not the glory, but his uncle's unwavering loyalty to family and faith. "Never fight for yourself, Yusuf," Shirkuh told him once, gripping his shoulder firmly. "Fight for what is right. A sword raised for greed cuts down its master." Though Saladin's father preferred patience and restraint, even he acknowledged Shirkuh's influence. "Your uncle is fire," he told his son. "Learn from his heat, but do not be consumed by it." Thus, Saladin grew beneath his uncle's shadow, learning strength, courage, and the power of loyalty. One evening, while traveling to a nearby village with a small escort, Saladin experienced the harsh reality of fear. Bandits ambushed their party, emerging from the trees with blades drawn. For the first time, Saladin saw death up close. His hands trembled, his chest tightened. Shirkuh, however, sprang into action, sword flashing in the dim light. Soldiers clashed with raiders, the air filled with shouts and steel. Saladin crouched behind a horse, paralyzed. He wanted to run but remembered his father's words. Courage is not the absence of fear, but standing firm despite it. Gathering himself, he picked up a small dagger, standing beside his uncle's men, though he did not strike a killing blow. His resolve to face danger rather than flee marked a turning point. When the raiders fled, Shirkuh clasped his nephew's shoulder. "You felt fear? Good. A man who does not feel fear is a fool. But you did not let it master you. That is courage." That night, Saladin lay awake, heart still pounding, but proud. He had seen fear and chosen to stand. The boy of studies and dreams was becoming the youth of resolve. Among all the scholars of Mosul, one stood out in shaping Saladin's character: Imam Yusuf al-Fadil, a jurist and teacher of humility. Unlike others who prized debate and showmanship, al-Fadil emphasized the inner life. "A ruler who cannot govern himself cannot govern men," he told his students. His lessons were not only in law but in self-control, patience, and mercy. Saladin admired this deeply. He asked the Imam countless questions. How should a judge treat enemies? What makes a man truly just? The Imam answered with parables of the prophets of Olazan and stories of past rulers, always ending with a quiet reminder: a man's strength is not in how he conquers others, but in how he conquers himself. Over time, al-Fadil became a trusted mentor. Najm ad-Din encouraged the bond, believing the Imam's humility would balance Shirkuh's fiery influence. One day, after a quarrel with other boys, Saladin stormed into the mosque angry. Al-Fadil sat him down and said gently, "Do not let anger drive your hand. Win first against yourself, then you will always win against others." This teaching stayed with him long after. It planted in Saladin the discipline of mercy, the ability to rule not with rage, but with fairness. Saladin's life now straddled two realms, the world of scholarship and the world of arms. By day, he studied law, history, and faith. By evening, he trained in swordplay, horsemanship, and strategy. He was, in truth, a child of two worlds, poised between scholar and soldier. At times, these worlds clashed. One morning, his tutor scolded him for arriving with bruised arms, evidence of last night's sparring. Books do not need swords, the tutor exclaimed. That evening, Shirkuh retorted, swords do not need books. Saladin, caught between, realized both were wrong if separated. He needed both. A ruler without wisdom was a tyrant. A ruler without strength was a pawn. His father, watching his son's struggle, reassured him, "You are not torn between two worlds, Yusuf. You are building a bridge between them. That bridge will one day carry nations." The boy embraced this truth. In the balance of ink and steel, he was forging himself into something unique. A leader who would embody both mind and might. By the close of his youth, Saladin was no longer merely Najm al Din's son or Shirkuh's nephew. He was becoming his own man, curious, disciplined, and steady. One night, as he prayed beneath the stars on the roof of their Mosul home, he felt a stirring in his soul. He thought of exile, of hardship, of lessons in faith and strength. He thought of caravans that passed through the gates, of distant lands, of Crusaders in the west. He whispered into the night, "O Allah, if you give me strength, let it be for justice. If you give me power, let it be for unity." It was the first time he articulated his dream, not only to himself but to God. The prayer marked a turning point. Soon after, his father remarked, "You are ready, my son, not to lead yet, but to walk the path toward it. Destiny has placed a burden upon you. Walk it with humility." Shirkuh, less poetic, simply clapped his nephew's shoulder. "Your time is coming." Thus ended the second phase of Saladin's life. The boy of exile had become the youth of vision. His path was opening, and destiny was calling. The summons came quietly, but it carried the weight of destiny. Najm al Dīn Ayyūb was ordered to relocate his household to Damascus, where Zengid's growing influence required loyal men. For the Ayyubid family, this was both a test and an opportunity. The caravan set out across plains and mountains. Along the way, young Saladin gazed in awe at landscapes that seemed to stretch forever. Villages clinging to hillsides, orchards heavy with fruit, desert winds sweeping across lonely roads. At night, he studied the stars with his father, learning how travelers charted their course by constellations. Damascus, when it appeared at last, stunned him. Minarets and domes gleamed in sunlight, bustling markets thrived, and the fragrance of jasmine filled the air. This was no longer the quieter Mosul. This was a city alive with culture, politics, and intrigue. Najm al Din prepared his son. "Here, Yusuf." Najm al Din prepared his son. "Here, Yusuf, you must listen twice as much as you speak. Damascus is a garden, but also a battlefield of minds." Saladin stepped through its gates with wonder. Though still young, he sensed this move would shape him more than any before. Damascus would be the stage where the child of exile began to glimpse the world. He was destined to change. Damascus was not only a city of commerce and politics, it was a city of learning. Here, mosques doubled as universities, and scholars gathered to teach sciences, theology, and literature. For Saladin, it was a paradise of knowledge. His father arranged lessons under some of the city's most respected teachers. Saladin immersed himself in Quran commentary, Islamic law, and the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ. He listened to fiery debates on philosophy, memorized lines of Arabic poetry, and marveled at the libraries, filled with scrolls and manuscripts. One day, a scholar placed before him a text of mathematics. At first confused, Saladin soon realized the value. If a ruler cannot count the wealth of his people, how can he protect it? Another day, he heard astronomers explain the movement of stars, reminding him of nights on the road with his father. Every lesson widened his horizon. He was not content to be a mere soldier or jurist. He wanted to be a man who understood the world deeply. A leader must be both sword and mind, he confided to his father. Najm al Din, proud, nodded silently. Damascus was becoming his classroom, and Saladin its most attentive student. Damascus' great bazaars were more than markets of silk and spices. They were markets of ideas. Walking through the bustling alleys, Saladin heard discussions about governance, science, and even philosophy imported from Greek and Persian texts. He listened to merchants debate fairness in trade, to scholars arguing about ethics, to preachers calling for justice in society. Each encounter deepened his understanding that leadership was not only about armies, but also about serving people's daily lives. One afternoon, he overheard a heated exchange, a merchant accused of cheating, a scholar defending honesty as the cornerstone of commerce. Saladin stepped closer, observing not the words alone, but how each man's reputation swayed the crowd. He realized then that power was built not just by wealth or weapons, but by trust. Back at home, he told his father what he had seen. Najm al Din smiled. Yes, Yusuf. A leader is not only obeyed, he is believed. The markets became Saladin's silent school. Amid scents of spices and the cries of vendors, the boy discovered that justice was not abstract. It lived in the streets, in the fairness of trade, and in the trust of the people. While Saladin immersed himself in Damascus's intellectual life, his uncle Shirkuh continued to blaze on the battlefield. His campaigns under Zengid brought tales of conquest and fierce loyalty back to the family. Home. When Shirkuh returned from one campaign, he placed his curved sword on the table before Saladin. Books make the mind sharp, he said, but steel makes the world obey. The boy traced the weapon's edge with awe, yet also with caution. He had seen what unchecked violence did. Still, he respected the power his uncle embodied. Shirkuh often trained his nephew personally in Damascus, leading him through drills of swordsmanship and horsemanship. The city's gardens echoed with the clatter of steel as uncle and nephew sparred. But Shirkuh also taught strategy, telling his nephew that battles were won, not by strength alone, but by foresight. Strike not where the enemy stands, but where he will move, he taught. Saladin listened closely, realizing that his uncle, beneath his fiery temper, was a master of tactics. These lessons, mixed with his father's wisdom, shaped Saladin into something rare, a mind that could wield both sword and law, both strategy and justice. As Saladin grew older, Damascus demanded more of him, no longer a mere observer. He began to serve as a junior aide in military preparations, under his uncle's watchful eye. At first, the work seemed tedious, inventorying supplies, checking provisions, ensuring weapons were in order. Yet Saladin quickly realized that armies did not march on courage alone. They marched on food, discipline, and careful planning. He accompanied soldiers on training marches carrying heavy packs. His shoulders ached, his feet blistered, but he refused to complain. A commander must know the burden of his men, he reminded himself. When disputes arose among soldiers, he watched how Shirkuh settled them, sometimes with firmness, sometimes with a jest. He learned that leadership required not only authority, but also the ability to keep men loyal through respect. Damascus was not without intrigue. Saladin, now nearly a young man, began to witness how loyalty could be both the strength and the weakness of men. He accompanied his uncle Shirkuh to meetings with emirs, where alliances were forged with handshakes and broken with whispers. Some pledged loyalty loudly in the court, only to scheme in secret. Saladin noticed the tension in Shirkuh's eyes. He trusted few for good reason. Once, during a campaign, Saladin overheard soldiers plotting to abandon their posts. His heart raced as he told Shirkuh. The uncle confronted the men, not with execution but with stern words. A man who breaks his oath dishonors himself. If you wish to flee, flee, But know that shame will follow. The men stayed, ashamed into loyalty. Saladin learned that loyalty was not only demanded, it was nurtured. True leaders inspired fidelity, not by fear but by honor. That night, as he lay awake, he realized that loyalty was the foundation of unity, the very dream he held for the Muslim world. Without it, no army or empire could stand. Saladin's first experience of war beyond training came during a minor siege. Led by Shirkuh, the enemy fortress stood strong, its high walls defiant against their encampment. From the camp, Saladin watched the preparations. Battering rams constructed, trenches dug, supplies rationed. The boy turned youth, learning that sieges were not glamorous. They were wars of hunger, patience, and endurance. When arrows rained down from the walls, fear tightened his chest. But he stood his ground. He carried water to soldiers, helped tend the wounded, and observed the grim faces of men enduring long days without progress. At night, he heard the cries of the hungry, both in their camp and from the fortress. War, he realized, punished not only soldiers, but also the innocent within. The siege ended in negotiation rather than conquest, and though Shirkuh was disappointed, Saladin left with a deeper lesson. True victory is not always in bloodshed, but in wisdom. War was not glory, it was burden. During his time in Damascus, Saladin wandered often into poorer districts. The glittering city of scholars also hid alleys of hunger and despair. One day, he saw children fighting over scraps of bread near a baker's stall. Their cries pierced him more than any battlefield. He gave what little coin he had, but it was not enough. Troubled, he returned to his father. Najm al Din explained, "Justice is not in feeding one man. It is in ensuring no man goes hungry. A ruler's duty is not only to guard borders, but to guard dignity." From that day, Saladin often shared his meals, ensuring no food in their household went to waste. More importantly, he began to dream of a just order where the weak would be protected, not exploited. This encounter changed him. War and politics were one thing, but the cries of the poor carved into his heart a sense of duty that no sword could silence. The lessons of loyalty, war, and poverty were shaping Saladin into something more than a soldier. He began to form a resolve, a noble vision of justice. One evening, he stood with his father on a hill overlooking Damascus. The city lights glimmered, beautiful yet divided. "Father," he said, "I see two worlds, one of wealth and power, another of hunger and despair. If God wills, I will spend my life closing the distance between them." Najm al Din placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you must carry that burden with humility, for justice is heavy, and only those who bow before God can bear it." From then, Saladin trained and studied with renewed purpose. He was no longer merely fulfilling family duty. He was preparing for a mission. His friends noticed the seriousness in his eyes, his teachers, the determination in his questions. Even Shirkuh, often dismissive of words, admitted, "The boy's heart is stronger than his sword." Thus, Saladin's noble resolve was born, not for conquest or glory, but for justice. By the end of his youth in Damascus, Saladin had grown from exile's child to a young man of vision. The seeds of greatness had been planted, watered by hardship, nourished by faith, sharpened by war, and softened by mercy. He now carried within him a rare balance: his father's justice, his uncle's strength, his teacher's wisdom, and his own noble resolve. He was still years away from power, yet those who met him sensed something unusual. A neighbor once remarked, "This boy carries the weight of more than himself." Saladin himself felt it too. In his prayers, he no longer asked only for knowledge or courage. He asked for the strength to serve others, to unite, to bring justice where there was division. One night, as he gazed at the stars, he whispered, "If greatness is written for me, let it not be for myself, but for the people I protect." Thus, the boy of exile, scholar, and soldier became the youth of destiny. The seeds were planted, and the world, though it did not yet know, was waiting for the man. They would one day call Saladin the Just. The moment came sooner than expected. At 19, Saladin was entrusted with his first command, a small detachment of soldiers tasked with protecting supply routes outside Damascus. It was a modest responsibility. But for a young man raised under his father's patience and his uncle's fire, it was the first true test of leadership. When the orders were given, Saladin felt the weight press upon him. These were not sparring matches or school debates. These were men whose lives depended on his judgment. He prayed before leaving, whispering for guidance. The march began with difficulty. Some soldiers tested him, doubting the boyish-faced commander. Yet Saladin did not lash out. Instead, he listened to their concerns, ate the same rations they ate, and carried burdens alongside them. Slowly, their skepticism melted into respect. When a group of raiders attempted to ambush their caravan, Saladin quickly formed his men into defensive lines. Calm under pressure, he ordered archers to higher ground while cavalry flanked. The raiders were repelled with minimal loss. His men, astonished, began to cheer his name. That night, Saladin did not boast. Instead, he sat quietly, thanking Allah for sparing his men. Leadership, he realized, was not about glory, but about responsibility. Shortly after his first command, Saladin faced a test, not of battle, but of judgment. Two soldiers under his authority quarreled over spoils taken from raiders. Their dispute grew heated, threatening to divide the detachment. Saladin summoned them before the men. Rather than siding quickly, he questioned each carefully, listening to their arguments. He inspected the disputed items and discovered that one had exaggerated his claim. Instead of punishing harshly, Saladin ordered restitution and declared, "Let no man's greed be greater than our unity." The soldiers accepted his decision, and the camp buzzed with surprise. Many expected a commander to shout or strike, but Saladin had resolved the issue with fairness. Later, Najm al Dīn reminded him, "Justice is the strongest shield a leader may wield. Men will forgive mistakes of strategy, but never injustice." Saladin carried these words like a seal upon his heart. Leadership, he now knew, was not just about courage. It was about wisdom and fairness. In moments of quiet between duties, Saladin returned often to the mosque. Leadership was heavy, and he leaned on faith to carry its burden. At dawn, he prayed fervently for guidance. In evenings, he studied Quran, reflecting on verses about justice, humility, and mercy. He fasted beyond obligation, testing his endurance. To his soldiers, this discipline became an example. They saw in him not a commander of privilege, but a man of conviction. One soldier whispered, "He fears God more than he fears defeat." Another said, "Such a man we will follow anywhere." His uncle, though less pious in manner, respected this devotion. "If your faith makes you stronger," Shirkuh admitted, "then hold it fast." In this way, Saladin's fortitude grew, not only in arms, but in spirit. His prayer mat became as important as his sword. He was learning that the strength to lead did not come from men's cheers, but from God's guidance. Resting in Damascus, Saladin overheard travelers speaking of Tikrit, the city of his birth and his family's exile. Memories stirred within him, the night of his father's disgrace, the weary caravan leaving their home, his mother's quiet tears. Though he had grown into a leader, the wound of exile had never left him. That night he spoke with his father. "Do you regret it, father, losing Tikrit?" Najm al Din shook his head. "No, my son. Exile was our teacher. Without it, you would not be the man you are. Never despise hardship. It is the forge of greatness." Saladin reflected long into the night. He realized that exile had given him endurance, humility, and empathy for the poor and displaced. These memories became part of his strength. When he next addressed his soldiers, he spoke not of conquest, but of perseverance. "I was born in exile," he told them, "but I stand here because hardship made me strong. You too can turn loss into power." The men cheered, inspired not by tales of glory, but by the honesty of their young commander resting in Damascus. Saladin overheard travelers speaking of Tikrit, the city of his birth and his family's exile. Memories stirred within him, the night of his father's disgrace, the weary caravan leaving their home, his mother's quiet tears. Though he had grown into a leader, the wound of exile had never left him. That night he spoke with his father. "Do you regret it, father, losing Tikrit?" Najm al Din shook his head. "No, my son. Exile was our teacher. Without it, you would not be the man you are. Never despise hardship. It is the forge of greatness." Saladin reflected long into the night. He realized that exile had given him endurance, humility, and empathy for the poor and displaced. These memories became part of his strength. When he next addressed his soldiers, he spoke not of conquest, but of perseverance. "I was born in exile," he told them, "but I stand here because hardship made me strong. You too can turn loss into power." The men cheered, inspired not by tales of glory, but by the honesty of their young commander. By his early 20s, Saladin had become not only Shirkuh's nephew, but his protégé. The fierce commander began to trust him with greater responsibilities: scouting missions, negotiation with locals, even leading small units. Shirkuh trained him in more than combat. He taught him how to read terrain, how to anticipate enemy movements, how to keep morale high during long campaigns. "The sword wins battles," Shirkuh said, "but the mind wins wars." One day, during a minor skirmish, Saladin was separated with a handful of men. He kept calm, maneuvered through rough terrain, and rejoined the main force without loss. When Shirkuh heard of it, he slapped his nephew's back and declared, "You are no longer a boy. You are a soldier." This mentorship deepened their bond. Though Shirkuh's fire and Saladin's restraint sometimes clashed, they respected each other. The young man absorbed all he could, shaping himself for a destiny still hidden but fast approaching. In Shirkuh, Saladin found not only a commander, but a model of loyalty and courage. And in Saladin, Shirkuh saw not just a nephew, but a rising leader who might one day surpass him. One evening, Saladin stood atop the ramparts of Damascus, gazing at the distant hills. He had seen enough of soldiers, merchants, and rulers to understand one truth: the Muslim world was divided. Petty rulers clung to their thrones, quarreling while the Crusaders held strong in their coastal fortresses. "Uncle," he asked Shirkuh, "why do we fight each other when enemies sit at our gates?" Shirkuh grunted, reluctant to answer. "Men love power more than unity, nephew. That is why." But Saladin dreamed differently. In his heart, he saw banners of Islam united under one purpose: not for conquest alone, but for justice. He envisioned armies marching not in rivalry, but in brotherhood, rulers serving their people rather than their ambition. Najm al Din encouraged this vision. "If God wills, Yusuf, perhaps you will be the one to heal these divisions." The words burned into his soul. Thus, the idea of unity became Saladin's private vow. He was no longer simply a soldier or scholar. He was a dreamer of a greater order. The vision would shape every step of his life. Henceforth, as Saladin matured, offers of wealth and luxury tempted him. Noblemen invited him to feasts, merchants promised gifts if he would favor them, and even whispers of marriage. Alliances reached his ears, but Saladin, though human, resisted. He ate sparingly, refused bribes, and lived simply. His bed was a mat, his robe plain. Soldiers remarked, "Our commander eats as we eat, sleeps as we sleep." This won him loyalty deeper than gold could buy. Once, Shirkuh teased him, Why refuse comfort? You are young." Saladin replied calmly, "If I indulge while my men endure hardship, I will lose their hearts. Duty comes before desire." Najm al Dīn, aging now, was proud. The true test of a ruler, he said, is not what he accepts, but what he refuses. Thus, Saladin built discipline. His refusal of luxury marked him apart from many rulers of his time. He chose service over self, planting the foundation of the man who would one day be known as a just king. By his mid-20s, Saladin's name had begun to carry weight. Soldiers respected his fairness, scholars admired his devotion, and nobles recognized his discipline. He was no longer simply Ayyub's son or Shirkuh's nephew. He was becoming a leader in his own right. During a regional dispute, he was asked to mediate between rival tribes. Though nervous, he approached calmly, listening to both sides, offering compromise and sealing peace with fairness. His reputation spread. Here was a man who could unite, not divide. His uncle boasted proudly, "The boy has the mind of a scholar, the heart of a soldier, and the patience of a judge." Even his father, weakened by age, declared, "Yusuf, you are no longer my student. You are my legacy." This was the dawn of Saladin's leadership. The exile's child had become a man whom others trusted, not by force alone, but by justice and humility. The world was beginning to notice. As his youth drew to a close, Saladin stood on the threshold of destiny. The lessons of exile, the training of Shirkuh, the wisdom of Najm al Dīn, and the cries of the poor, all had shaped him. He was now a man whose vision stretched far beyond Damascus. The world around him trembled. Crusader states loomed, Muslim rulers quarreled, and the people longed for justice. Saladin knew the time would come when he must step forward, not for ambition, but for duty. One evening he prayed at the Umayyad mosque, "O Allah, grant me strength to unite, wisdom to rule justly, and courage to defend what is sacred." Rising from his prayer, he felt a calm resolve settle over him. His father passed away soon after, leaving him with both grief and responsibility. Shirkuh, still at his side, declared, The road ahead will be long, nephew, but you are ready." And so, the boy born in exile became the man destined for greatness. The road ahead stretched into the pages of history, where he would rise as Saladin the Just, the unifier, the liberator, the leader remembered for centuries. And so, dear viewers, our journey through the early years of Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub comes to a close. From the cries of an infant born in exile to the calm resolve of a young man destined for greatness, we have traced the footsteps that shaped one of history's most enduring figures. Saladin's story reminds us that true greatness does not begin with crowns or palaces. It begins in hardship, in lessons whispered by fathers, in the fiery example of uncles, in the kindness shown to the poor, and in the silent prayers of the night. Exile forged his endurance, faith anchored his spirit, and justice became his guiding light. Though he would go on to face empires and carve his name into history, the essence of Saladin was already written in these first chapters of his life. His legacy was not built upon conquest alone, but upon mercy, humility, and an unshakable devotion to unity and justice. As you close this chapter with us, Remember, every great leader begins as a child of circumstance, but becomes great by the choices he makes. Saladin chose honor. What will you choose?